In the first movie, we completed the very top of the sock and got down to the top of the heel. We'll resume here, knitting the last few rows of the 50-row leg. 43, 44, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 50. We now knit the heel on half of the total needles, so that's 30 for this cylinder. The other needles go into holding position, which is all the way up, similar to them being all the way extended in a Japanese flatbed knitting machine. The shape of the heel makes a pocket of knitting, so the big weights don't have a chance to pull that knitting down, and we really need something to do it. So I usually use these heavy forks that I invented for the process. The Auto Knitter manual has you pulling down manually with the work hook. We must move the weights or the hook as the pocket develops to keep the positioning optimal. This counts as the first short row. We place the last needle that knitted on this first half and hold. Now this is where normally you would use this tensioner, and mine's no good. But it doesn't matter if you are willing to manually tension. You don't really have to have that tension spring for main knitting, but it sure helps now because look at what's happening. A yarn loop is forming. So I'm going to get that yarn loop out of the way. Everybody knitted off well, but did you see that that one didn't really want to? Time to move a weight. And this one didn't really want to, so same thing over here. You do have to move them frequently, and you do want to be careful to not damage stitches when you do. Turn the crank the opposite direction, knit around on the remaining needles, place one into hold, either with your fingertips or with the tool. Pull out the slack, if you have it, as I do. Knit in the other direction, place the last needle that knitted into hold, move the weights as necessary. And repeat until on the shortest row, 10 needles have knitted. On average, I find that I need to move my weights to the optimal position about every 4 rows. They should be directly under the needles that are presently knitting and not allowing any pockets to form above them. If you have any stitches that aren't knitting off, it indicates there's not enough downward pressure in the right position, whether you're using weights or pulling down. We're almost there, and once we're down to 10 stitches having knitted, we'll begin to reverse the process and return one needle to work. Here comes the last one to go into hold, and I also will have a stitch fail to knit off, and I went off camera after this and fixed it. Fixing boo-boos isn't a movie by itself. Time to short row out. On the side away from the yarn carrier, push one needle back down to working position. Knit around, making extra sure that needle does knit off. Be careful about accidentally nudging needles out of hold. I did that. They need to stay there or problems will ensue. Quick heel review. We knitted on half of the total needles, in this case 30. We short row in until only 1/3 of those that began the heel are still in work. In this case 10 needles. Then we begin short rowing out, increasing the length of each row by 1 stitch by placing the needle away from the yarn carrier back into work. That's the first needle that was knitted on the most recent row. Continue adding a stitch to work every row until all 30, or half of the total in the case of another size of cylinder, have knitted at least one time. When you return them to work, do make sure the latches don't pop closed. They must stay open in order to be certain of a successful stitch. The short rowing method that I am showing you is called the automatic wrap. You may recognize it from flatbed knitting. It is possible to short row with a literal wrap, where we take the yarn and wrap it around the nearest held needle at the end of each row. But I find that more difficult on a circular sock machine, and this works so well. When the heel is complete, all of those needles that were in hold should be pushed back to working position Make sure the latches are open and we'll resume knitting in the round. We have to return them to working position in stages. They're not all accessible to us at any one moment. Sometime I'll take the machine apart for you and show you why that's true. Now just knit the number of rounds that were determined by the original arithmetic to get the correct foot size. Remember, that's another video. When those rows are complete, it's time to knit the toe, which is worked exactly like the heel. Place half of the stitches in hold. Place the extra weights in position if you're using them or some kind of pull-down mechanism. Short row in until only 1/3 of the needles have worked. Short row out again, and then we're ready to scrap off. I leave a long tail of main yarn and drop it down in the center of the work so that I can use it to Kitchener stitch. And now I'm pulling through some waste yarn. The waste yarn tail needs to drop down inside the cylinder just before the first needle it must knit. The first waste yarn needle is the one immediately after the last main yarn stitch. And I'm going to have to tension my hand for a moment. There we go. This first stitch may want to grow, and we really don't want that because it could cause the next stitch to it to drop. We need to return all the cylinder needles to work now so that we knit complete rounds, a complete tube with waste yarn so as to be able to remove the sock from the machine. Knit that first round very carefully. It's very easy to drop stitches here, and unfortunately I did drop one. Right at the end like this, I just pick it up and fix it later. To make sure I do get a good waste yarn tube, I will hang that strand of yarn back on its needle. We want at least 1 inch, but 2 inches is a lot easier to deal with. I only have a little bit of this yellow, which is a great contrast, but I can change colors after the first few rows, and it will still serve its purpose of contrasting with the main yarn. Knit enough waste to be able to remove the sock while leaving knitting on the machine. A sock nearly finished. All we have left to do is close the toes and make a couple of repairs. Both of those are covered in different movies.